Okay. Okay. So I have some ideas. Rather than prepare them in like written form, which isn't quite as fast as I want, these are thoughts that I have about relationships, relationship like theory, I guess you would call it. And so let me share my screen. Am I sharing my screen already? I am. Okay, cool. All right, so where exactly should I start with this? Yeah, let's start with the picture. Okay, so this right here, this this leaf-shaped thing is what I imagine for my theory of no, not really a theory. It's me trying to figure out what's the best way to manage relationships, understanding that time is finite, and that in a lot of cases understanding is finite, meaning you don't get unlimited time with everybody to make things perfect, and you don't get to perfectly communicate with everybody to make things perfect. So you have these problems that need to be overcome. Well, let's stop screen sharing for now. Oh wait, what's going on? I am screen sharing. Pause share. Yeah. Am I resume share? Stop share. Oh yeah, there's the buttons right there. Duh. Okay, so I think going into this philosophy of relationship management, there's just a couple of things that they're like prerequisites to they're called anachronisms. They're like little tidbits that you have to like temporarily accept before you can get to the next thing. And I think the anachronisms to this one are one, the understanding or the belief that the family is not an organism. It's not a single entity that has singular goals and singular functions. And perhaps at one time in human history, families did function that way. But I think given the opportunity and the independence and the mobility today, it doesn't really work to look at least a family of adults like ours. I don't think it makes sense to look at them as an organism, right? So in that way, there is no the family. There is no the family does this, the family does that, because the potential for individuation is just too high. Like when you grew up in Swee County, Iowa, and you lived in a town of 400 there, and you were all farmers, like, okay, and there was one church, it's like, okay, well, got a pretty good chance of being pretty similar. And so maybe you might be able to fall into like an organism type structure without it being like too damaging to you, because at a certain point your society is going to control what you're able to do. And if your society is super conforming with agriculture and being Baptist, and you're like, well, I don't really care for agriculture, then it's like, oh, look at this guy, causing problems for everyone. So I think anachronism number one is that the family is not an organism. And so the question is, what is it? I would say it's a network. And then I think anachronism number two is that a family network exists. Well, this is Brittany actually mentioned Brittany explained this system to me. It's open family systems versus closed family systems. And if I remember correctly, which I'm not certain I do, open family systems were more focused on like, hey, the family organization exists for the benefit of the individual members, not vice versa, where the individual members exist to perpetuate the family, which once again might have been important in past times, like in Sicily, in like where you've had these families like literally like fighting to survive against other families and stuff. Like, sure, that makes sense, but not entirely the case now. And the opportunity for social mobility and individuation, I think, makes that untenable in present day. So the family is not an organism. The family is a network of individuals, and that network of individuals exists to further the interests of the individuals. It's a system of cooperation and exchange, kind of like capitalism. Of course, it's not all run on capital, though. There's not a lot of monetary value to what we do as a family, but there's other kinds of value. And I'm not going to dig into that right now because I think, one, it could be wildly subjective as to what kind of value you're looking for, what kind of value you're getting. But two, it's like that's a completely different can of worms, and it's not really where I did my thinking on this. But okay, so share the screen again. Share the yep. Okay, so this is my theory of what a family network of relationships looks like, right? It might have. Okay, so here's a good example. When I was looking up information about this image popped up. This came from, it was a criticism of Microsoft's position as a broker of information from different systems. So they never really meant to make a complete criticism of like family structures. They were doing like data handling and like company ecosystems. But I think some of their insights were particularly interesting. Now, in this example on the left, you've got, your typical patriarch and then your, members of the family. And this looks like a family tree, which is fine. In this case, the patriarch represents Microsoft. And the problem that they're explaining in this article is that Microsoft gatekeeps all communication. So if Asian Jeff here wanted to talk to, Pretty Lucy over here, he would have to go through Microsoft to talk to Pretty Lucy. And that's a problem for software developers, which is why they advocated for an open modular system where communication could be more direct and blah, 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 and et cetera. Now, that doesn't have a whole lot to do with what I'm about to show, but there was an important reason why I brought this up. Why did I bring it up? Oh, because there's a lot of different ways a family network could be conceived of being shaped. You could have a patriarch who, has to sign off on every interaction. One of those crazy controlling types who who starts like screaming and like gets the entire family in the car and goes for like a 4-hour Sunday drive where like nobody's allowed to talk, but like if you don't answer his question, then clearly that's insane. And maybe that's why the criticism of Microsoft in this case is so valuable. But anyways, so despite the fact that a family system could look different or a network could look different, it seems to me, okay, one more anachronism before we get totally kicked off. Okay. Okay, so my third anachronism is that relationships are permanent. Relationships don't get deleted or disappear. And so in that way, all relationships are permanent, but some are more present, right? So here's the thing, like your family relationship, you have family members, they have names and stations, and they're like organized in a chronological hierarchy. It's like this one's older than the other one. This one, had sex with this one to make this one. And, there's all kinds of stuff built in there that you're never ever going to forget, that your brain is extremely good at remembering. How do I make this more concise? So you don't get to get rid of family relationships. You can't just like write somebody off and never have to interact with them again, because like you're gonna have to interact with them again. Or furthermore, maybe you like move to Russia and never talk to anybody again. The problem is that relationship still exists. It's just not being maintained. It's not being engaged with. It's not a present relationship. It's just still there though. And from what we learn about like trauma and stuff, like there's a lot of your behaviors were created by traumas that you don't even particularly recognize. They're kind of like little t traumas. So like you're a product of your family network, clearly, and those people aren't going to go anywhere. And furthermore, the people you went to a class with, or that you served on your mission with, those are still relationships that can't get deleted, don't disappear. Like I go out into public and I, especially now with the mask covering half the face and having been inside, I see people that I think I know everywhere. And then like within a second, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's not them. Because my brain is like, oh yeah, I remember people. And my brain is like, I think I see such and such person that I haven't thought about in 10 years in the grocery store. And then like half a second later, it's like, no, that's not him. It's like, so, okay, so that information is there. And my brain is scraping to maintain it and to recognize it in the world around me. So anachronism 3 is that relationships are permanent. They don't go anywhere. They're not going to disappear. And that was relevant because and particularly, I think anachronism number 4 perhaps then is defining what a relationship is. A relationship is any kind of, well, I want to say relationship, any kind of relationship. If you walk out of one class, or if you walking to lunch, pass another person 3 or 4 times and you recognize that it's the same person, like you now have a relationship with that person. Congratulations. And it's not much of a relationship, but like your brain and your whole body, your whole physiology is going to scream to act differently because you're around that person. It's like, don't make eye contact, or like smile a little bit, or like nod or wave or say hi. Like you can't just be normal. You can't just properly live your life like unaffected by that. You pass a coworker on the way to the bathroom, it's like like you have to give them some kind of acknowledgement. It's like it's part of your hardware, I guess. So there's a lot of relationships of varied value and magnitude and quality and content, but I think that relationships in general are permanent things that you can't get away from, even if you would want to. And so if you had like a stupid abusive relationship with somebody, like clearly the solution is not pretend it never happened, don't think about it as much as you can, drink alcohol when you do think about it so you don't have to think about it anymore. Like that's clearly not the therapeutic outcome. You have to find some kind of resolution to it. You have to either forgive them or forgive you, or like get even, or like there's just something you have to do with that negative experience in order to make it something that you're actually like finished with. Because pretending it wasn't there, or doesn't exist, or doesn't have to exist is just doesn't cut it. And I don't think it cuts it anywhere from the extreme example of years of abuse all the way down to the very bottom level. I don't think there's anything that flicks your conscience that you can actually get away from without dealing with. Anyways, okay, so back to this. You're A, right? And this is your family. You have 15 siblings. I think there's 16 points on this. Yeah, 16. So you're A, and you have direct relationships with B and with C and with D and, you know, everybody, you know, because they're people that you know, they're people in your family. You've been introduced, you understand their place in the hierarchy. These people are totally established. And not only that, but they all know that you know all of them as well. And that's kind of an aside, that's kind of the next step. But first thing I want to call attention to is that A has a relationship with C and A has a relationship with D, but A does not have C's relationship with D, right? D and C have their own relationship. D has D's own relationship with L, and D has D's own relationship with M, but D does not have L and M's relationship. Now, D, L, and M could, you know, be in a group environment, a group setting where you have like you have like these tandem relationships and perhaps even a unique relationship because there's three of them. But D, L, and M don't necessarily share the same relationships. And so that brings me to the next part is when I was sketching out this shape here, I thought, you know what, hey, this is just a, I'm drawing 16 points and I'm like, okay, in a family network, all of those 16 points would be connected to all the other 16 points, right? Not like E to D and D to C, like they all have to be directly attached to every other point to properly represent a family network of relationships the way that I'm thinking of. So what I found are simplexes. Simplexes are a geometric structure or a geometric shape, but they're not always, they look like two-dimensional shapes here, but they are actually projections of shapes of different dimensions, right? So for example, we had a good visualization here. Anyways, okay, a one simplex is a line segment, right? You've got 2 points and you've got a line to them. A two simplex is a triangle, right? You've got 3 points and all of those points are connected, not just together, but interconnected to each other. So each of the 3 points is touching all of the 3 points. That's cool. Now, a 4 simplex or a 3 simplex is called a tetrahedron. That's something that exists in the 3-dimensional world, right? You know, it's a pyramid, you know, 3-sided pyramid at least. Now, when you project a pyramid, a tetrahedron onto a flat plane, like this 2-dimensional example above, this, you know, the 2-dimensional is what you get. It's an example of taking a 3-dimensional object and projecting it onto a 2-dimensional plane. And if that's confusing, don't worry. You totally already understand how this works. Works with maps. Maps are projections. The way that a lot of maps are designed is there are better visualizations of this. But basically, you know, a globe, a sphere is not flat. And when you flatten things out, there's distortion because you're taking something that has 3 dimensions of information and then you're trying to bottleneck that into 2 dimensions of information. It's like, okay, you're going to lose something, right? And what you lose is a spatial component. Now, when you're using maps, you need the spatial component because you're trying to navigate, but you don't have the same problem when it's just geometry because it's not really spatial anymore at that point. So this is a projection. This simplex, this 3 simplex here is a projection of a tetrahedron, right? And that's a 3-dimensional shape. Now, next step is a little harder. We got a 4-dimensional shape. Well, you know, they've done a visual, they've done this nice little 3-dimensional visualization of what a a four-dimensional object should look like, but that's also not quite correct. 4 dimensions is something that you can't look at and you can't hold. It's part of space-time, and it's difficult, but you can provide a projection of a 4 simplex, and it looks like this, nice little pentagram here. And once again, all of the points are interconnected with each other. All of them have a direct line to the other 5 points. Anyways, it goes up from there, right? You got your 5-plex and your 6-plex and your 7 simplex and your 8 simplex. And I'm not going to go into the math too much because I don't understand it super well. And besides, the math isn't terribly important to where I'm going with this. But 16 simplex is 16 simplex. Ooh, yes, cool. So the 16 simplex is just this thing here, except instead of just showing A's relationships, right? All these lines going out, it's the relationship network and map for all of these points, right? So here's the tricky part. How many relationships is that, right? I mean, we know that if you look at an individual A, right, you can count the lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I think I counted that wrong because there's 16 dots. So shouldn't there be 15 lines? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah, 15. Okay, so A has 15 relationships here. And 15 relationships is easy enough for A to manage without either losing their mind or losing quality to those relationships or having too much to process. But the problem with a 16 simplex is, how many relationships is that? I'm not sure that that's 15 times 16. It could be fewer. Now, to make it a little bit easier, they've got this nice table of some numbers that go along with simplexes up to 10. And so there are in simplex elements, right? A 10 simplex, for example, has 11 faces, vertices, which would be these outside line connectors, which is interesting. But then we get something like 55 going up from there, and then where you've got multiple intersecting lines, you've got like 165 making strange little shaped territories. You've got 330. Gets to the point where you can sum up the faces, the complex where the lines cross. Depending on how many lines cross, you've got a different kind of shape. And those shapes all come to, on a 10 simplex, they come to 2047. So let's look at a 10 simplex really quick. If you had a family of 10 people, all of these little shapes are representative of crossings of lines, right? So this territory here, this little, okay, yeah, well, that's a little big. This territory here right in the middle, for example, is formed by the crossing of 1, 2 lines from each of these points, right? And so I'm not going to dive into what each one of these mean because I haven't figured that out yet. But the idea behind this then is that that all of the geometric complexities and morphology of all these little panes, they represent a complexity in a relationship, right? It's this guy's relationship affected by this guy's relationship and this guy's relationship. What this guy thinks of this guy, when this guy's around, and blah blah blah. It's all too much. It's impossible to wrap your head around. or maybe it isn't impossible, but it's certainly hard, and nobody thinks that way, right? The problem is that we conduct our relationships that way. So, in the case of this 16 simplex here, no, don't do that. There we go. We behave this way in our relationships. We have opinions about other people's relationships. We talk, A talks with B about the dynamic going on between J, K, and L. And that's all well and good, except for it's too complex. You can't properly attend to it. And furthermore, J, K, and L, you can't properly represent what somebody else thinks, which is why it's important for somebody else to speak for themselves, right? And that's also why it's important to communicate directly instead of sending messenger boys or you play the telephone game. Everybody already knows the telephone game. That's not helpful. Classic fallacy in communication is he said, she said. It's nonsense. And so the therapeutic thing is always, well, you need to engage in direct communication. It's like, well, I can't directly communicate with such and such person because I killed their dog in cold blood and ate it in front of them, and they've promised never to speak to me again. It's like, well, okay. Well, if you're going to improve that relationship at all in some way, you're going to have to eventually get to direct communication. And so, there's mediated conversation, which isn't what we do when we're talking about other people or telling somebody else what somebody else did. That's not mediation. Mediation is actually when there's three people in the room and somebody who understands how mediation works and is able to control for bias and is able to communicate clearly without changing it. That's a different kind of thing than what we do. What we do is this ultimately unproductive little gossipy thing where we perhaps have like a cathartic release by complaining about something that bothers us and getting somebody else to agree with us. Problem is that if J, K, and L are complaining about C and D or C or the way that C and E ran off together, one, they're not communicating with C and E, so nothing that they say is going to be helpful for their relationship with C and E or C or E. But two, well, it's inherently non-productive, and two, it might also just be incorrect. There's a high probability of that. In fact, I would say you have a transmission issue where it's like, if I'm, just like telephone, A tells B something, C gets a fraction of what that original message was, passes it to D, who gets a fraction of that, and it only gets worse as things move. So my theory then, summing all this up, my theory is that the 16 simplex has too many complexities to handle. No one actor, no one individual is able to properly remember the content of these relationships, and so they shouldn't try to, or they shouldn't kid themselves into thinking that they are. What would be healthier instead is for A to manage A's own network of relationships, right? And perhaps at a simpler level, so for example, if we take a 2 simplex, why did I click on that? If we take a 2 simplex, right? The 3 people got together and they're doing something, like, you have a very clear relationship there. You see, like, there's no intersecting lines, like big open face, like that's interesting. Clearly a one-to-one relationship. There's not a whole lot of confusion that goes in there. The moment you start complicating it, though, you got 6 people in a room and they're having clearly you're not all communicating with each other at the same time. It's like, duh. The 2 simplex, it's 3 people. It's like, okay, well, that's almost like an algebraic relationship. Like, one, you can see both of the things. You can see both the other points, so you know what they are. And if you didn't know what a third point was, you can know one point, you can know yourself, and then so you can do the math on what the third point did. But once we start complicating these relationships, one, you're not communicating directly anymore. like a 1 or perhaps a 2. And so you've got all kinds of loss of information. And so you can't reasonably be assured that you understand really anything that's going on at that point, because it's not behaving as a single relationship. You don't have a relationship with the family. You have a relationship with a member of the family network. In fact, you have relationships with everyone in the family network. And so my recommendation, I think, is understanding that these numbers are far too complex. Don't attempt to manage. Don't attempt to manage meta relationships. Only manage your direct relationships. For example, if you have a direct relationship with B, and B says C did something really shitty to me, rather than talk about C, you talk to B about B. It's like, B, how do you feel? I feel really shitty because C did something really shitty to me. Well, I'm sorry you feel shitty, B, says A. And here's the part, of course, where it gets difficult, is like, well, to what extent do you get involved in meta relationships to your own peril because they're too much for you to handle and keep straight, right? People act differently, around different people. People are comfortable with other people. And, and certainly there's group dynamic. You get 5 of these people in a room, you're going to have a very different kind of like environment and culture, microculture, than if you get these 5 people in a room. And that's okay, except for the fact that like you don't live in a room with those people. You just get temporarily into a room with those people. You have to live with your network of people, and you don't always get to have those interactions with those specific 5 people that keep the culture feeling precisely the way you prefer. You can only manage your individual relationships because those are the only ones that are permanent. Furthermore, they're the only ones you actually have control over. Once you start adding more people into a group, the group becomes a reflection of like an average, or like it's a blending of the thing, and you can't interact with a group either. You can only really interact with people, individuals. So rather than meddle in other people's relationships, rather than have thoughts about other people's relationships, manage your own relationships and attempt to improve them. And I think the improvement of relationships starts with I've already thought of this. I, for some reason, got distracted off of it. The improvement of relationships, right? You're going to have stuff like respect, or rapport, positive rapport, which I don't know is necessarily the same as respect, but you're going to have relationships that make you feel good. You're going to have relationships that are beneficial, like work relationships, in a family, for example, though, like you're going to have to manage the negative aspects that come into relationships, because you don't get to terminate a relationship just because it got negative, because it's going to be there. And furthermore, that negativity, when unmanaged, is just going to find its way back into your life somehow, through some network of exchanges with other people. So that's the thing too, is if you can't produce, well, rather than saying that, negativity is something that you need to enforce boundaries about, right? Like I meant to write this down before, but I didn't. So there's paper. There we go. Sharpie. Okay, all right. What was it? It was sorry. Yeah. Oh, low power. I don't care about that. Turn that back on. Okay. All right. Clearly, this is all exceptionally subjective. It's going to come down to you. But this Punnett square should be a good way for you to determine what's too negative for you, right? So you've got feels good in this column here. You've got feels bad in this column here. Now you've got good for you on this row here, and you've got bad for you on this row here. So for example, nope, I'll partner that with the highlighter. If you're having a conversation with somebody, or you're having an interaction with somebody, or you have some chore or something to do, and it falls into this classification, bad for you, but feels good, like catharsis, catharsis can be bad for you. Catharsis, for example, is perhaps the experience of satisfaction or release you get when you hit a punching bag. You're angry, and so you hit a punching bag, and then you feel better. Well, that's catharsis. The problem with that kind of catharsis, though, is that you increase your dependence on catharsis the more that you experience catharsis, right? So when you feel stressed again, you have an increased need to go and hit the punching bag because you are, like dialing yourself in dopaminergically, in terms of dopamine releases, you're dialing yourself in to manage stress that way, or manage negativity that way. But you can also have cathartic release in a lot of different ways, like complaining, shouting, swearing, talking to somebody. Not all catharsis is bad. In fact, there's plenty of catharsis that's great and good for you. But there's catharsis that's bad for you. And so I would say something to the effect of talking shit about people, gossiping about people, it's bad for you. Because so like expressing and understanding your feelings clearly is important. Like your feelings can be like unhelpful, but they're still there, and they're still good to, well, they're not good. They're not good or bad. Your feelings are what they are. They might not be ultimately helpful to what you want, and that's kind of like a strategic concern. But feelings are just feelings, and expressing them is good. Now, are you expressing them in a therapeutic and productive way, or are you expressing them in a destructive, a non-productive, non-generative kind of way? Well, that's precisely what you have to understand about yourself and come to terms with. So you could have something in any other situation. If I'm having a conversation with Seth, and something about the conversation feels bad but is good for me, like, Seth, I have to apologize because for all these years I've been drawing pictures of you, in which you have like poop on your shirt or something, and I've been laughing about it for years with a group of horrible people on the internet. Like, clearly that's going to feel bad, but apologizing and repairing that relationship, good for me. So you're going to want to do those things that are good for you, right? In fact, you're probably going to want to be doing all three of these. Good for you feels good for you feels bad. Oh no, you don't want to do bad for you feels bad. And you don't really want to be doing feels good for you. So you'll probably end up doing this kind of stuff for the most part. If you've got some especially pathological experiences, negative, unhealthy behaviors, then yeah, you'll be doing things that feel bad and are bad for you. But for the most part, you should be doing it here. But anyways, so the point is that if you're having a an exchange with somebody and they're expressing negativity, it's not always like, oh, hey, keep that negativity away from me because I'm a sunshine spirit and I don't have negativity in my life, man. It's like, no, you have negativity in your life. And if you avoid negativity in your life, because you don't want to confront it or you don't want to experience it, it's like, bummer, that's going to find you. Like, I feel negativity about doing homework. Well, guess what? Like, just because I've avoided it for the last 2 years doesn't suddenly make me have a degree. Finishing the degree gets the homework away for forever. So, negativity be damned, had to do it anyways. It still haven't, but whatever. Working on that. So if you're talking with such and such a person and you come to the determination that it feels bad and isn't good for you, you know, then it's time for boundaries. You say, hey, um, I don't want to talk about this. I don't like talking about this. I'm trying not to talk about this. I'm out of energy for this. I'm burnt out on that. Don't want to talk to you about that today. Let's talk about something different. I don't do this. I don't do that. And that's the exercising of boundaries, is like, hey, you know what? You can have a relationship with somebody that has like a concept of informed consent going with it. You don't have to have a toxic relationship with somebody. Even if you have a history of having a toxic relationship with them, you get to put up boundaries. You're like, no, I'm not going to go on a date with you because you're weird, but we work together and I'm going to treat you professionally. Like, ta-da, that's a boundary. Now the other person might not respect your boundary, at which point, you're getting like more disrespect. And so it's like, okay, well, it's time for another boundary. You don't get to disrespect me this way, or blah, blah, because I'm going to change my behavior or my availability, or blah, 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 blah. And if, there's nothing particularly wrong about telling people like, hey, I'm not trying to ingest this much negativity. You think of like therapists, like they're listening to people complain about, terrible things all day. And it's for, the express purpose of bettering their lives. And so like my therapist, for example, we had to cancel a session this week because she had to take her husband to the emergency room. Like, well, that's insane. She was like all apologizing to me for like missing our session. I was like, no, you don't have to apologize for that. But like she deals with that kind of negativity all the time. And I think I'm not really entirely sure how psychologists deal with that kind of stuff on a regular basis, but the entire intent is that the negativity is being expressed and managed and directed to a therapeutic goal, which is ultimately good for you. Right now, the problem is that your family members aren't therapists, they're not counselors, they're not psychiatrists, they're not even particularly life coaches. And so one, they probably have an extremely limited tolerance for how much negativity they can take. Two, they're probably not really good at keeping that negativity from like entering their own lives, like through bias. Is like, yeah, I heard a negative story about Walmart, so I hate Walmart too, even though my experiences with Walmart have been, like fine. I just can't believe that such and such person had a bad time at Walmart. It's like, okay. But you can't manage your life that way. It's too complex. You immediately come into the territory of the simplex, where it's too big and there's too much to manage. And so my concept is that you just have to prune out all of those meta relationships and only focus on your own relationships, just your own relationships, just your own direct relationships, because everything else is untenable. You can't remember how you felt and what you thought about how such and such person interacted with such and such person at a thing. And like, yeah, it's important to have some understanding of meta relationships. For example, you wouldn't go hang out with somebody who just started punching everybody they knew in the face for no reason, right? Like, because their conduct with other people informs you something about what their conduct with you could be. It's like, okay, yeah, there is a certain necessity for meta relationships, but you're going to pick up on that information automatically anyways, right? That's not something that requires your active attention, right? And furthermore, that's not something you can control in the slightest bit. You don't control what you hear about other people. You don't control other people's, relationships with third and fourth parties, people you don't even know. You don't have any control over my relationship with my coworkers at work. But if you hear that I, stole $1 billion from all of my coworkers and ran away with their wives, probably you wouldn't trust me with your money or your wives. big surprise. But that's automatic, right? And when it comes to things that you have to do manually, you have to manually manage your relationships. You have to manually talk to other people. You have to manually and intentionally and on purpose manage your relationships with other people. Those don't autopilot. You don't just hear about like, oh yeah, I went out with a friend and I had a great time. Like you do that, and so when it's in your area of control, when it's in something that's of your determining, I think it's best to focus entirely on your direct relationships and not engage with meta relationships in the slightest bit. And so that might mean, as you adopt that idea, that might mean that you throw out all of your meta relationships altogether. You'd be like, hey, I don't know anything about such and such such and such person's relationship with this and this, and everything I know about Josh, I know because Seth told me. It's like, okay, well, perhaps in the interest of having a direct relationship, you should more or less throw everything out. You can't like delete it, you can't forget it, but you should more or less say like, hey, the information I have is not primary sourced information. It's not information I received from a direct relationship, and my feelings about that person don't derive from a direct relationship with that person either. So rather than construct my model of the world and my model of that person in the world, rather than construct that out of information that I didn't get directly from that relationship, it's better if I construct that relationship out of information that I received from that relationship. And that, I think, one, in terms of how I imagine that going in practice for our family, right? Like our family has some relationships that are more developed than others, some relationships that are more positive than others. We've got some tiffs and some feuds. We've got some tiffs and feuds that perhaps are like people say they're over, but they're not. You've got all kinds of complexity, and it's I think a waste of time for an individual member of that simplex network to try and keep track of. I think it's too much to keep track of. I think it's impossible to keep track of it properly. And I think even if you did perfectly understand, if you did the superhuman thing of perfectly understanding absolutely every one of the more than 2,000 little sub mixtures of relationships, you have coherence issues where it's like, well, I know that such and such two people are at odds. Well, what if those two people quietly had a nice phone conversation and their relationship is suddenly a lot better, and they didn't tell you about that because it's none of your business, really. You still operate under the assumption that those people have, a relationship that's not the relationship that they have. You suffer from this decoherence, even if you did know everything. Now, the thing about decoherence, though, is that if everybody is operating off of direct relationships, right, as opposed to trying to figure out all the little weird shapes of the simplex, if everybody's managing their direct relationships, then you don't have any decoherence, right? Because you remember the last encounter you had with such and such a person. Now, you don't remember precisely what they've thought about in that period of time, but you can figure that out if you have honest conversation with them, which is kind of the idea about the simplex, is that, or of a healthy relationship, is that you should have a direct and honest communication with people. And that often requires that you have a direct and honest relationship with yourself, and that you don't lie to yourself, and that you don't delude yourself, because delusion is a dangerous thing. Delusion is going to change absolutely everything in your entire world. It's going to change the way you see the world, because you chose to see the world a way that it wasn't. Everything else is going to is going to have to fit that world model that you've constructed. So anyways, that's why it's part of why lies, not necessarily even lies, just incorrect information. That's why accepting information that can't possibly be full quality is so dangerous. It's like, well, how am I supposed to make a decision based on he said, she said this? That's like 6 people. That's something that I have nothing to do with. That's something I know nothing about. I'm meant to like now construct a model of the world based off of information that I couldn't possibly have any confidence in. It's like, how good can it get? It's like one-to-one conversation. That's like at best 100% honesty, right? That's like 100% for quality. You add a third person into that. It's like, okay, he said that this person told my thumb and my thumb told my pinky. It's like, how much information do you think you retained through that? It's like all of it. Probably not all of it. I think it's impossible actually for you to retain all of that information. And furthermore, you couldn't possibly have the understanding because of how important delivery is and nonverbal is. The way that I tell you what I tell you is far more important. And if you didn't understand something about the way you're just going to transmit it wrong. So like the moment you start chaining people together, you just, how can you have any confidence that what you're getting is actionable information that you should have any strong opinions about? Just a waste of time, because I don't believe, and I think the simplex is a good mathematical proof of this idea. I don't believe that it's possible for an individual to manage a relationship network that's that big. So you have to simplify it. You have to deal with just your direct relationships. If you're in a 16 simplex family of 16 people, which ours is bigger than that, everybody who knows everybody else and is in part of the family, the family and hierarchy tracking and blah, blah, blah. Like it's bigger than 16. So the number only gets more and more complicated, and nobody's smart enough to do it. Nobody's smart enough to manage that. If you were to try and put that into an Excel sheet, right? Like perfect memory, an Excel sheet has perfect memory. So if you were to take those, 16 simplex, well, a 10 simplex has 2047 cells, right? So that would be like if you took, 2047 rows or a combination of rows and columns. It's just too much. And 16 is already too much, and we're bigger than 16. So don't even try to manage meta relationships and relationships that aren't yours and your opinions about other people's opinions. It's a waste of time. You can't do it properly. You're just going to make your world unmanageable, and incorrect and decoherent and out of tune with reality. Manage your own relationships. Just your primarily direct relationships. Make those relationships as good as you can make them. Try to improve them. If they're not fantastic, then try to create boundaries, and enforce healthy boundaries in a respectful way, so you can keep excess negativity out of your life. If you've got relationships where an exchange of negativity is consistent, try your best to make it good for you as opposed to non-productive. Don't just engage in catharsis thinking like, oh well, hey, I engaged in catharsis, so it's good for me. It's like, no, if it's not productive, if it doesn't make you and the people you're talking to, or even the people you're talking about, if it doesn't make them better, you probably shouldn't do it. And of course, that's all so complex. That is the realm of so many different kinds of psychology. This is just it's a fragment. It's the beginnings of a theory of relationship management. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much for listening to it. I'd love to hear what you have to say and feedback, because I like it. And it doesn't just apply to families. I am thinking about how to apply this more generally into a relationship management. Like, I don't want to call it a system, but looking at relationships as a network and being able to keep track of relationships, at least in a business sense, is also very interesting to me. And so this example of a network, a family network or a family simplex. Um, Very interesting. So appreciate your time if you watched all.